Blessings, my brothers and my sisters. We greet you today with the joy of the Lord Jesus Christ. And certainly we thank God for this opportunity for us to come together virtually to discuss a matter that is crucial and critical to our community and actually to the world at large. October is Domestic Violence Month, and we are coming to the end of October, and we thought it would be special. We thought it would be fitting for us to discuss, have a panel discussion with some experts just to talk about domestic violence and some of the nuances around it. And so we welcome you tonight, and we're grateful for the panelists that have joined us. And we're going to let them introduce themselves tonight.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Sherry Lynn Lilly, and I am a mental health professional that works at the Allen Women's Resource Center currently doing counseling services. I also work in private practice, and I have some areas of specialty such as trauma. I'm also an emotional wellness coach, parenting coach, and there's a lot of things that I do, but mostly I love God and I love to serve others. So yes, that's me.
Good evening. My name is Lori Banks. I am a member of the Greater Allen A.M.E. Cathedral. I was also the former director of the Allen Women's Resource Center. I've been working with DV since 2005 when the first Family Justice Center was opened up in Brooklyn, and I was doing my internship to get my master's in counseling. So that's where I started dealing with domestic violence and also being a survivor of domestic violence. So it's just amazing how God brings you back to the beginning of what you try to run away from. Mm-hmm. So therefore, you know, domestic violence has always been very near and dear to me. While working at the Allen Women's Resource Center, I didn't look at it as a job, but I looked at it as ministry to see what we can do to help the women and the families that were coming through the shelter. I thoroughly enjoyed the work, and I just want to continue being an advocate for the women, and especially the children who are the forgotten ones that suffer with domestic violence. So therefore, that's who I am. I have a master's in counseling. I'm also a life coach and want to continue doing what the Lord has planned for me to do in my retirement years.
Your second retirement. Right. Okay, Ms. Lilly, would you define domestic violence, please? There's just so many nuances to this term.
Yeah, I think for the purpose of our conversation today, I'm going to make a distinction between domestic violence and intimate partner violence.
Good.
So domestic violence really is any violent interaction. It could be physical, emotional, psychological, financial, and now even digital between two people that live in the same household. So it could be a mother and daughter. It could be an uncle and sister, like any combination of people that live in the same household. And in some states, they extend that to like if you live in the same building. That's domestic violence. Intimate partner violence really is the same kind of definition, but between two people who share intimacy. So spouses, boyfriend, girlfriend, etc. So that's the main distinction, right? But it's violence in many forms. So we often kind of limit it to kind of the physical violence. One of the hardest types of domestic violence to really work with is emotional and psychological violence because you can't see it. It's not tangible.
Right.
And so like there's a level of kind of belief that you have to buy into when someone says they're being emotionally or psychologically abused. Yeah.
Right. And you know, I often think about the financial portion. You know, when you talk about domestic violence, it can actually be, you know, delve into the areas of finance, emotional availability, and so there's another kind of violence that really transcends or is different from physical violence.
And oftentimes they actually intersect. So if you have a person that's having physical violence, most likely they're having emotional, psychological violence as well. So a lot of times there's an intersection between the different categories. Financial abuse often, again, has mental and emotional abuse intersecting with it. So you see it kind of in a lot of different ways where they cross each other.
Right. Yeah. Lori, we'll start with you. What are some of the psychological factors surrounding domestic violence as it relates to the abuser and the abused?
Okay, generally with the abuser, a lot of them it has been indoctrinated in them because they've been brought up under the same situations, the same circumstances. So it's an ingrown thing with them. They were in households where they were, they witnessed domestic violence. They were themselves violated by the abuser. So that's for the abuser. Now, for the one that's being abused, the psychological is the trauma. She's afraid that she can't make it on her own. She has a lot of things that are her integrity. She has suffered from low self-esteem, so she doesn't think that she can do anything for herself. That she needs this person to more or less validate her. So emotionally, she doesn't know what she can do. Most of them are not financially equipped to be able to go out there on their own. Right. They're totally dependent on the abuser for everything. And the abuser, controls. He even controls the point where if they want to go to church, they can't even go to church. There are things that they just are not allowed to do. If they go to the store, well, what are you buying? When are you coming back? What took you so long? So the psychological thing of just being alone. Isolated. They are totally isolated. And they isolated not only from their friends and their family, but just from talking to the next door neighbor. It's total isolation. So what happens is that when they get that opportunity and the abuser feels like they're getting away from them, then they really start cramping down harder on keeping tabs on what they're doing, who they're doing it with, and what they're saying. So it's just, it's a mental thing. And what you try to do with the abusee is try to just give them some sort of realms that they're able to more or less move forward and feel better about themselves.
Right. Ms. Lily, you have anything to add to that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, psychological factors, it's complex, right? Because often what you see is cycles of abuse. So whether it's identified as domestic violence or not, most times you sit down with whether abuser or abusee and you look into their history, the psychological factors start with the fact that they themselves were somehow exposed to abuse, whether it's child neglect, whether it's substance abuse of a parent, whether they, it manifests in and then the other thing is that if I could funnel down a little bit and pull out for a minute, because this is my passion, is the distinction between the way that people of color experience domestic violence versus those who are not people of color.
Okay.
Because the psychological factors for us are a little bit different.
Okay.
And so domestic violence shares a lot of things no matter what ethnicity you are. But when you talk about psychological factors and you go back and you're looking at what contributes to cycles of domestic violence. For us, it could start with just a young lady in school who's being punished more for her smart mouth and the way she dresses than maybe her white, Caucasian, or other counterpart, right? It could be looking at the absent fathers in the household and mothers doing whatever they had to do to survive. So there's lots of complexities around psychological factors. And then, of course, the things that Ms. Banks identified, right? The isolation, the manipulation, the violation, right? Boundary crossings and all of that kind of stuff. But I think that it's really important. I was reading some statistics, and I don't like statistics because they don't tell the truth, right? Because oftentimes people of color were the last to report. Exactly. Right? There's a lot of shame that comes with it across the board. But for us, it's embedded, right, in our intergenerational trauma that comes from our history, even with slavery, right? And there's one other thing I'd like to say really quickly. There's a psychologist named Dr. Seaman, and he makes this statement. He says, "You will know them by their fruit, but you'll understand them by their root." And so oftentimes when you see, working in the shelter, you'll see our families, you'll see our moms, and even the children kind of manifesting certain types of behaviors, outbursts, anger, depression, sadness. It looks a lot of different ways. And until you get to the root of it, you never really understand what it is that they've experienced.
Right.
Yeah.
So with both of you working at the shelter, one of the things that I'm sure you have experienced is someone checking in, but they return. And so I guess my question is, what do you think, what goes into the returning? What makes them return? What makes them stay? And then what makes them return?
What makes them stay is the fact that they feel a sort of safety. They feel the unconditional love that's gathered to not only them, but also to the children. They leave.
You mean stay at the shelter, yes.
They leave because they feel as though they're being re-victimized, because they're coming in and there are rules and regulations. They're not able to just live their lives the way they were used to living them. They've come into a shelter where they've left their apartments, they've left their freedom, and they're coming into a space where they're being told exactly what it is you can do, what you can't do, and they're
what
adults.
Time you have to do it.
What time you have to do it, when you can do it, and then the children are looking at them as if, but this is my mother, but she also has rules and regulations like I have to do. And then you find that there's not a lot of resources for them while they're in the shelter. Yes, they come in, and they have, some of them have had to leave their own apartments that the abuser was able to stay in, but there's no affordable housing. So they're sitting back waiting for the city to give them some sort of voucher to move them into affordable housing. And we all know that affordable housing does not exist in New York City. Not only that, there are too many elements, too many other areas of individuals that are vying for these limited housing opportunities. Because you have those aging out of foster care, you have the seniors, you have the vets, you have the mentally ill. You just have all these different groups,
demographics, yes.
Demographics. And say one time you come to the shelter, it was an automatic guarantee that you were going to get an apartment. That's not happening anymore.
It's not happening.
It's not happening anymore. So a lot of them feel as though they're being re-victimized, and they've said it. You know, I might as well stay with the abuse because I feel like I'm being abused all over again. And it's the tone and the way you have to, they're women, they've been through things. But there are ways that we as workers have to make them feel comfortable. We don't want to re-victimize them. But it's very hard for them to accept us and to trust us. So there's a big trust factor when they come into the shelter. And for the ones that we were able to really work with and migrate and get them into better places, we've seen the fruits of our labors. But for those that, just feel like they just don't want to stay, they leave.
Right.
And they're afraid because they leave also because their families, for the cultures, there's a cultural difference. Families turn away from them. They leave their marriages and the families disown them. So they're really totally by themselves. Because in certain cultures, you don't do that. You don't leave.
You stay.
You stay.
Regardless
of what. You stay. You deal with it and you continue to just abide by it. And most of them do not have any jobs. They don't have any education, so they're stuck. And on the other side, if they leave, then they really stand a chance of being murdered, because that's the worst thing you can do. You can't leave because this is their property. We've had individuals at the shelter where the abuser found out where they were.
Oh my God.
And we had to really, keep them covered, trying to make sure that we can find a safe place for them to.
You had to remove them immediately.
But it's not immediate. It's not immediate because you got to find a place for them to go.
Have to find it.
You have to find a place for them to go, and it's not easy.
Ms. Lily?
Yeah, here is one statistic that is kind of general, and that is that it takes about 7 times before a victim actually stays away from their abuser. And I think all of what Ms. Banks said is absolutely true. But I think the systems that are set up around domestic violence and intimate partner violence sometimes compels them to go back because they make it so difficult. It's like, I'm the one that's being victimized, but I'm also the one that's being punished. I have to leave my apartment. I have to bring my children away, separate them from their father or whomever, change schools. Everything is on me. And many times you'll see the moms. We have moms right now, but we've had a male recently. But you see the moms in our shelter just say it's just too much. So sometimes you have them returning because of that reason. But I also want to point out that sometimes the return has to do with trauma bonding. It has to do with the relationship that they have built with this person over time. And so the skewed idea of what love is, you know, and the please forgive me, I'm never going to do it again. So all of that, and a lot of victims that return have their own love deficits, if you want to put it that way.
Okay.
Right? So how they connect with their skewed idea of what love looks like when they come into the shelter, it's almost like they can't even imagine anything else. So part of trauma bonding even is you come into a place that's calm, there's no chaos, no one's yelling at you, no one's mentally abusing you, and it feels so foreign that you almost like have anxiety and you got to go back to what feels normal. So they've normalized their violent situations, and although they it doesn't feel good, they leave. When they get where they're going, sometimes the calmness and the safety is equally as scary as the violence. And that makes it sound really, really strange, like to most of us.
Right.
But what happens in the brain, trauma changes the way you think. It fries your circuits in terms of the way you process information. Things don't make sense the same way that they did before you were traumatized. And so we can't really work with domestic violence victims with the mindset of a healthy person. You have to really work with them as a trauma person. Really using trauma-informed empathy, understanding. You can't fix it. You can't impose kind of your thoughts, ideas, and ethics.
What's normal for you, right?
Onto them, because they'll reject it. And that's another thing that sometimes pushes them away. That's some of the re-victimization. And lastly, I'll say that, again, because my passion is really working with families of color, is that I've done some trainings recently that kind of talks about the big buy-in, right? Where we are women of color. We're all women of color sitting here at this table. And something that's been embedded in us from our intergenerational trauma is, girl, you better pull yourself up by the bootstraps and keep it moving, right? And so when our residents come into our shelter, we do this intake process and we hear the story. And in the moment, we get it. But after a while, we separate from the story, and all we see is that person again. Here comes that statement. You know them by their fruit. So you're observing behavior. And you're frustrated with them. Oh, she's just angry. Oh, she's not telling us the truth. And you start just connecting with the behavior, forgetting that there's a root, which is domestic violence.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow. So you mentioned the abuser and the promises, I'm not going to do it again. And so I guess my question would be, is it possible, or how likely is it, how often do we see abusers change?
Abusers will only change if they recognize that they have a problem. There are various groups that they have to work with abusers. And male groups where they can sit down and talk about their problems and what's going on with them. They can change, but they have to want to change. They have to understand and recognize that they do have a problem. You know, for the most part, I used to always think, because I was a victim of growing up in a household with domestic violence, that because a man drank and it was that then the abuse came about. But I was taking classes and finding out that wasn't the case. There was some innate things with the male, that the anger, the things that he went through in his life, that he just automatically just took it out on the female. So you look at the male and you say, they can change, but they have to want to change, and they have to have a partner that's going to walk with them and step with them to help them to get the change. A lot of them don't know what love is. You know, they think love is being abused.
Love is violence.
Violence is love is violence. They'll tell them, I didn't do the right thing, or he told me not to do this. They take onus. They take onus that it's their fault, but it's not. It's because they both have come from very traumatized childhoods and backgrounds. And so they just interrelated with each other, and they don't know what it is. I think, for the most part, I know there's a group called Connect. They have a men's forum. They meet every month, and they sit down and they talk about their problems so men can hear that they're not the only ones going through it. And a lot of men just have anger issues. They have anger issues because they don't feel as though they're not supplying the needs for their family like they should. They feel less than. And the women, and some of us don't help because we edge them on. But in the same token, it takes both parties to understand that there is a problem. And there's a hope that the love that was there in the beginning can be rekindled. But with everything that's going on in the world, we bring that into the household. We bring that into the relationship, and then they're just, you can't separate it. I had a bad day at work. Who am I going to take it out on? I'm taking it out on the person that's safe. And that's what happens when they come into the shelter. And close. And that's what happens within the shelter. We're safe. So they yell at us, they curse at us, and we take it all in. But we have to realize that it's not about us. So we just have to overlook that. And it takes a big person to have somebody come at you every day cursing at you, and you're saying, okay. Because our thing is we're going to retaliate, but it's not. We have to look at where they're coming from, and we're safe. And they know that we are not going to inflict any more harm.
Okay.
Change is entirely possible. The problem is access. So how quickly can I get an abuser? Ms. Banks and I are really good friends, right? But she's kind of showing her age. She keeps referring to the abuser as male. There are female abusers, right? But regardless of whether they're male or female, if you are the abuser, like the stigma around the abuser, right? Which in a sense is kind of, it's going to be what it's going to be, right? You are the abuser. You're the perpetrator of violence, right? So you're not going to be looked upon with joy, right? So, but to consider that an abuser themselves is in as much pain and that's what they're inflicting on their victim, and to see them as valuable enough to get them help is, I think, in our community, not something that we do well. We don't do well. So access, I'm glad that you mentioned the program, Ms. Banks, because now someone who watches this will know there is somewhere I can go. But stigma, shame, all of these things keep us hidden inside, keep us inside the house, keep us inside the four walls, right? What is the old adage? What you do in this house stays in this. Like, all of these things are embedded in our culture and our cultural norms, right? So when you have an abuser that really desires change, where do they start? How do they begin, right? And how do we decrease stigma and shame around it so that they can come out and allow the help to be effective? Yeah.
So you know what I was thinking, you talked about the female abuser. And you watch movies and you see the reality that sometimes women are verbally abusive. And their verbal abuse. Now, there's no excuse, but I'm saying that many times women can be verbally abusive, and then that just kind of instigates a kind of physical abuse, or it can be the opposite. A man can be verbally abusive, and the woman can then become physical. So that's an important, I think, nuance to this whole notion of domestic violence.
Yeah, I agree. I've had some experience with domestic violence that started off totally mental and emotional. And it did become physical, but it was one time because of who I am. It wasn't going to happen again.
Okay.
I'm just saying. But the mental and emotional was hard for me to break away from because I didn't recognize it right away. It was so subtle that, and then when I look back now, part of the reason it infiltrated my sense of self is because I myself had deficits. I was a broken person myself. I was a child of abuse, right? So someone comes along and just kind of innately as human beings, we're predators. We don't mean to be, but we kind of hone in. And this was a part that was prevalent. Like, this is what showed up for me at the time because I was that much broken. And so it was easy for this person to kind of be manipulative. And then the other thing that I learned afterwards was that he has mental illness. He's bipolar. So I was trying to figure out what's with the swings, like you love me today and hate me tomorrow, right? And the abuse that came with that. And so that's one thing we haven't talked about a little bit is that sometimes what you see in abusive relationships is that one person may be suffering from a mental illness. And if it's something that isn't like what would be described as kind of prevalent, like with real outward signs, right? Like maybe schizophrenia is something that looks a certain way. People with bipolar 2 don't really have mania, so you don't see psychosis, but you see these extreme mood swings.
Right.
And if they've never been diagnosed, then you're just trying to figure out, like I was, my abuser was bipolar. And the swings were so extreme. I love you, and I'm on top of the world. Everything's perfect. You're the best wife. I'm going to be the best husband, etc. And then when they came down to the other side, it's like, don't talk to me, and could literally shut down and not speak to me for 6 weeks. And here I am in the relationship, trying to have conversation. I'm making meals. And being rejected, right? And so it perpetuates these cycles. And here I was, a broken person, and I'm a victim of abuse, not understanding that I was a victim of abuse. So it's just really, it's very, like you said, Reverend Elaine, it's very nuanced. Like everybody's situation looks completely different than the next person. Yeah.
Exactly. And so what gives one the courage to leave?
You want to take this one, Spence?
You wake up one morning and you say, enough is enough. And you just say, life there's more to life than this. And you get up the courage. It takes a while because you're afraid of the unknown, because you're used to being with this person. So you don't know what it's going to look like once you step across that threshold to find out that I can be. For myself, when I was in an abusive relationship, I watched my mother go through what she went through. And I promised myself that I would never go through what she went through. And so I just started preparing myself for that, the inevitable. When my father died when I was very young, so my mother went through those types of nuances about being alone. And I loved my husband, but I would never be totally dependent on him, not because I didn't think the marriage would last, but if he would die or something, then I would still be alone and broken. And one thing I found about with domestic violence, there's such a correlation between domestic violence and child and sexual abuse, because it starts right there. That's your first notion of abuse if you've been molested as a child. So it just carries on throughout your whole life, because you never addressed it, because whatever happens in the house,
silence.
You stay in the house. You didn't say anything to anybody because nobody would believe you. So that's your first indoctrination to abuse, and it just continues until you start getting the help that you need in order to be able to move forward. I got my help by going to school, and I went to a group, and this woman talked about how she was sexually abused by her grandfather. Her story was my story, and she was just so open and free, and that's when I was able to just start shedding the layers of shame and abuse that I had felt throughout my whole entire life. And then getting into a domestic violence relationship with my husband, it was like, okay, I can't deal with this. There's more to me than that. And I watched. My grandmother said something to me that was just very so prevalent, and my mother too. Me and my husband were having some sort of disagreement. So I left the house. I'm thinking, I'm going to my mother, and she's going to protect me.
A safe space.
My mother called my husband and said, yes, she's here, and I'm sending her back home. Well, that was a shock. I was appalled. That's when I realized whatever I want to do, I have to do it on my own, because there is no help. It's me. My grandma, because they took it. They didn't have the opportunities to be able to be self-sufficient and take care of themselves. So they took it. I refused to take it. And I was fortunate I only had the one child. But for some women, they have multiple children, and they cannot see living or trying to raise and prepare these children by themselves. So it starts with child sexual abuse. And mostly most of the research that I did when I was working things, that was the underlying cause.
And you said something very interesting in terms of our mothers and our grandmothers. There was no such term as domestic violence when we were, when we were younger. Domestic violence is like a 21st century term. That was not in the nomenclature of our generation, especially the younger us. And so they told you to stay. They expected that you would stay, and
Because they stayed.
They
stayed, and they didn't know. They didn't know any better.
Right.
We come along. I can do this. I'm not going to allow anybody to just disrespect me because of who I am.
Right.
So
Right.
then
Miss
we
Lily.
just, Miss Lily.
Yeah, and I'm saying that I'm always fascinated, you know, when we get into spaces like this where Miss Banks, who's like a generation like my mama, right? But when she tells her story, it's my story, like even down to the abuse by a grandparent, right? It's just amazing. And working at the shelter where our moms are relatively young, the last group really were in their 20s. I think we have some 30s now and maybe a 40, but when they sit with me in counseling sessions, I'm listening and I'm going, oh my gosh, that is so totally my story. It really makes the work for me very, very, very meaningful because it reminds me that it really could be anybody. It really,
Exactly.
really could be anybody. But getting out, leaving, staying out, oftentimes it's the moms looking into the eyes of their children and going, I don't want this for you. And getting the courage to leave.
Because of the children.
Because of the children. And then when they get to the shelter, they start going, especially if the abuser was the father, they feel bad. And some of the work that I have to do is to help them to distinguish the difference between their relationship with the abuser and the abuser's relationship with the children. Some of the other work I do is, Mom, think of what you just modeled for your child when you got up and walked away from violence. So you're looking at your girls, let's say, and you're going, oh my God, I just removed them from their father who loves them tremendously. He's only abusive to me. But in essence, he's really abusive to them too when he's abusing their mother.
Exactly.
And so it takes courage to say, you know what? I want to model something different for my children so that if they're ever in a situation where they're being violated, they have the courage to get up and walk away and know that this is behavior that is completely unacceptable. So oftentimes it's looking into the eyes of their children that really say, I've got to go. Fear. Sometimes it's getting to the end of it and going, I don't have the energy to do this anymore. And they finally walk away.
Okay.
Yeah.
So now, and we talked about this. We grew up in the time, Lori and I did, where there were absolutely no resources available.
Oh, me too. I only look 34.
So, what resources are available for women who are victims of domestic violence today?
I think a lot of the resources depend on where you live, but generally speaking, the shelter system is one of those resources, right, where a woman can leave now and find safe haven. And that really is going to vary from state to state and from country to country, right? And then once you're in the shelter system, then you're looking at what are the housing options, what are the mental health options, what are the advocacy and legal options. So those resources now are funneled through kind of the governmental agencies. And then there's a lot of private, nonprofit advocacy organizations out there that if you Google, you'll find them all. They're all right there, right? So in that way, everybody has a smartphone now. Moms can actually leave and sit on the bench and figure out what to do right in the moment with their children sitting next to them, because you can just Google and an agency will come up, or you can tell them. Safe Horizon is pretty much in every police station. So if you go to a police precinct, there is a domestic violence unit right in the precinct. So those are some of the resources that are currently available. And again, it will vary from state to state. There are a lot of hotline numbers. I didn't come prepared with them today. I forgot to bring them, but there are a lot of hotline numbers. Safe Horizon has a hotline number. There's another one called Nova that is a hotline number for domestic violence. So that's another resource that you can call a number 24 hours a day. Here in New York City, you can also call NYC Well and get help. So those are some of the resources. I don't know if Ms. Banks has some more.
They have the New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. You can also go and Google them. You have Connect, which is an organization in Harlem that works with domestic violence abusers and abusees. There's
the Family Justice
the Family Justice Center, which was, but they started it as a one-stop shop for domestic violence. You go to the Family Justice Center, and anything that you need, it's right there. That's why they call it one-stop. They have lawyers, they have advocates, they have all the various domestic violence agencies, organizations that can help you. They have lawyers if you have, cultural issues. If you have you need green cards, whatever you need, language, they have everything is right there. So they call it one stop, and so it's there in every borough within New York City. So you just go to Family Justice Center, and they will hook you up with an agency, with anybody.
Okay, great.
Google.
So we have with us Sister Aaliyah
ma'am.
Wickham.
Wickham, yes.
Wickham, who is a graduate of the Allen Women's Resource Center. And so we welcome you, and we'd like to hear from you, hear your story, and just tell us what has happened with you in the last few weeks, months, years. years. Yeah.
It's been a few years.
Thank you guys. Thank you guys. It's been a minute. It's been a journey, really. I found myself in, one of those situations where it was a unhappy, unhealthy, unsafe home for myself and my children, and I had to immediately leave. I did the wait and see. I did the let's try to get some help. I did I'll try it on my own. I'll try to find a place on my own, and I'll just remove myself. But ultimately, when the heat came on, I literally had to grab my kids and run. Right. And Allen's Resource Center was there for us. It's not the ideal situation for anybody.
Right.
I mean,
we know that.
Especially when you're accustomed to being independent and taking care of your own day-to-day, situation. But it was absolutely God-sent. It was absolutely needed. It was absolutely necessary. And my kids and I were thankful, for the resources provided for us at Allen's Women. During that time there, we were able to find some quiet. We were able to plan and to strategize our next level in our life, our next chapter. Where we want to be, what we want to do. I personally had to restart. But I'm not against restarting. It's
hard.
It's hard, but it's like building something brand new from the foundation up. You get to do it the way you always envisioned it. And so, I put myself back into school, because I finally had the peace of mind to focus.
Right.
So from Allen's, shelter, I went back to school. I graduated with honors, got a certificate, thank you, of medical billing and coding at your college.
Okay,
so,
good for you.
My kids restarted school in a new area. They were able to actually link us with apartments. So we got a base to start over. Again, everything is not ideal, but it's appreciated, and it's workable, it's doable, and it was someplace safe, and it was much needed and deeply appreciated.
So what's happening with you now? You've moved into your own place, and you got your degree from York.
Yeah, unfortunately, as the way the real world goes, no matter what you know in your brain, they're like, well, if you don't have, half a lifetime of experience, it's difficult breaking in. So I kind of had to shelf using that degree for the moment. I'm still, plotting on getting there, but I tapped back into what I've done before, which. I was being a real estate agent, which, thank you. Now that I had, again, a stable, safe home and, quiet and peace, and my kids figured out, I had more, I was able to focus, and pursue all my career goals. Okay, so now I'm able to work more, get deals done.
So how long ago did you leave the shelter? When you went and then you left?
Okay. I went into the shelter September 2016. We spent about 6 months, 5 to 6 months there. We were transferred into our new apartment the end of March 2017. So we've been there since. And you know,
It's about 5 years.
again, stable, peaceful living. Okay, nothing can beat that, especially when kids are involved. You know, I mean, everyone mental health was you know, I mean, it's still something that I'm still working with. The residue and you know the effects of that. It's something that I mean, still need to get out. Then,
How old are your children now?
my eldest is 17. My youngest is 2. But at the time of that incident, I've had just 3. So my youngest in that incident was 9.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, very good.
Ms. Wickham was able to be a part of the Locust Manor project
Oh, wonderful.
because we were given 6, 7 apartments for victims of domestic violence. So she was one of the first ones that was able to move into a brand new apartment.
Good
at
for
Locust
you.
Manor.
Brand new. Yes. Yes.
So yes, so she's one of our success stories. She's always worked hard. You know, she was a pleasure to have in the shelter. She did everything that she was supposed to do, and her children were just lovely. And she's our success because
You have how many children now?
4.
4. Okay.
And so Ms. Wickham was a go-getter. She didn't sit back and wait for somebody to give anything to her. Whatever she wanted, she made sure that we got it for her.
Okay.
Yes.
She was, yes. And we still keep in contact with the women at Locust Manor because
Absolutely.
aftercare, whatever they need, whatever their needs are, they call us and we're right there, to fully support them.
Absolutely. And it's much appreciated, especially Miss Lily's service to keep our mentals straight, to keep our mentals together, okay?
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's
And so you work with the mothers as well as the children.
I work with the moms and the children. I work with the families at Locust Manor. And I think that what Ms. Wickham is expressing, right, is that, even after a victim or survivor of domestic violence kind of gets back on their feet, there are long-term effects, right? There's long-term effects of what's happening in their mind, depression and other things that may just kind of linger, starting over, like Ms. Wickham said, like you're starting from foundation. Ms. Wickham has the personality, though, to do that kind of with a little bit more ease than others. Not every woman gets the kind of start and momentum and knows where to begin, and they need a lot more support on their journey back to independence and autonomy. And sometimes that's one of the factors that makes them go back, is that the struggle to figure out how to start again is so real that they may return. But thankfully, I work with Ms. Wickham still. We talk often. And and that's one of the nice things about AWRC too, is that we do provide aftercare, not just for the families at Locust Manor, but when families leave our shelter, I try to transition them into ongoing mental health services, but I'll stay with them long enough for them to feel mentally stable enough or find their own therapist, and I'll continue to provide services to them and their family. I've done some home visits, so this is kind of like the hands-on approach of our shelter that may be a little bit different than maybe like a city shelter or maybe other shelters. But because of the size, which is beautiful, I wish we could be bigger because I think we have such an amazing program. We need to reach more, but we don't have the space. But right now, our size is such a benefit, especially for me, who is like, I'm in there and I'm sitting on the floor with the children. And just for the record, I'm totally blind, right? But it doesn't stop the passion that you have to really see families succeed. Right, and one of the benefits of having such a small shelter is that we can be as hands-on as we are at AWRC. Yeah.
Wonderful,
Yeah.
wonderful. Well, okay, I think we have done it, and we are so glad that you came.
Thank you.
But I'd just like for everyone to just give us a closing statement and just talk a little, and you have done that. You've talked about the Women's Resource Center, but just kind of give us some closing statements, and then we're going to be on our way. Lori, we can start with you.
Allen's Women's Resource Center is special. Not only do we help the women that are in the shelter, but we extend our services to those that have been going for 5, 6, 7 years. They still call back. Whatever their needs are, we're there. We don't just turn our backs on them because they're no longer in the shelter. They're always a part of our family. And we're family. And because we're small, I always had an open door policy. You know, anybody can come in my office, you know, the residents, the children.
The kids.
The children would
They
come
open
and
their
say,
drawer and take stuff out.
the children would come in and say, Ms. Banks, you always have meetings with the mothers. Can we have a meeting? So they'd all sit around my table and they'd have their meetings and they'd talk. Because that's the type of facility that we have. We're open, we're warm. And it's not just, I'm the boss, but I'm just one of them. They can feel that they can come and talk to me about anything. Especially since most of them think I'm their grandmother anyway. You remind me of my grandmother. But, you know, I just thoroughly enjoyed the opportunity of being there. And it's always a pleasure. You see residents like Ms. Wickham and quite a few others who came through the shelter, and they've done so well, and they've maintained themselves and their children. When the children come back to visit, some of them don't want to leave. And we come back, they don't want to leave. And sometimes when they go to get their apartments, you know, they have to leave. The children were running high. They didn't want to leave. They didn't want to leave. So we love them. And I thank you, Reverend Elaine, for the opportunity to serve in the capacity that I did. It was warm, it was enlightening, and it just made me a better person. Be more appreciative of the things that we have that we take so much for granted. You know, they have to stay in the shelter. We leave, but they have to stay. So we always have to be very cognizant of how we treat them, how we look at them, and we never try to make them feel that they're less than. Because only by the grace of God that it wasn't one of us.
Absolutely.
That's right.
We've talked a lot about the shelter, and I think I've expressed my heart and my love for it. But what I will say is that if you are feeling like potentially you're unsure, unclear, whether or not you are a victim of domestic violence, here are some of the things that you can look out for. Are you feeling isolated? Have you been separated from your family? Do you feel alone? Is there physical violence where you're being hit and then there are apologies afterwards that they'll never do it again until next week and they do it again? Do you have access to your finances? How are your children feeling? Can you come and go as you please in your home? So if you feel, suspect, or unsure, how's your mental health? You know, do you feel like the person controls your mind or doesn't give you the ability to think for yourselves, makes decisions for you, and you have no say? So if you're feeling any of those things, then potentially you are a victim of domestic violence, and you can leave. There is help. There is hope. And again, I'm so sorry I don't have the numbers on me. I don't have them memorized. It's terrible. But Safe Horizon and NOVA are the two main sources, NOVA and Safe Horizon. If you call, you can Google it, and it's an 800 number. You can just Google domestic violence hotline. That'll be the first thing that pops up. Right. Then you can make a phone call. Or if you want to go into your local precinct, if you're here in New York City, because I know Reverend Elaine is worldwide, whatever it is, wherever you are, here in New York City, you can walk into a police precinct and ask for the domestic violence unit, and they can help you. But if you are experiencing domestic violence, we are here. You can reach out for help. This is the Greater Allen Cathedral, who is the founder of the Allen Women's Resource Center, your local church, a trusted friend. Reach out and we'll be there to help you. Yeah.
Right. And you can also go to the Allen Women's Resource website. awrc.org. In order for you to find out all the information about Allen Women's Resource Center and other resources that are available to you.
Those hotline numbers and stuff,
So,
yeah.
And let me just say before Ms. Wickham comes, you can't choose to come to Allen.
No.
You have to be
Right.
placed. So there's a likely chance you will not end up at the Allen Women's Resource Center, but we will get you the help that you need.
You'll direct you, yeah.
Right. Okay, Ms. Wickham.
To piggyback off of Ms. Lilly, if you're experiencing a domestic violence situation, my recommendation is to leave as early as possible because it never really gets better. We can hope it does. We can pray it does. We want it to. We may love the other person with everything within us, but it never really gets better. And the longer you stay, the more harm you're causing yourself and your children, if there are children involved. So seek the help. There are lots of help available, lots of agencies. Get the help and get out as soon as you can. It'll be the best thing that you can do for yourself and for your children. It's difficult, but it's rewarding in the long run.
Amen. You know, this has been a great experience, and I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank God for this opportunity. And I would just like to say that the Allen Women's Resource Center is a gift from God. I think it was in 1983 that we first wrote the proposal. Many of you have heard me say this. We wrote a proposal not really expecting that we would get funded immediately, but we did. And we thank God that since 1983, the Allen Women's Resource Center has been housing women and children who are victims of domestic violence. And we even had, and men, I was just getting ready to say, yes, we've even had men. And so what we want you to do is know that we believe as a church and as the people of God, that we know that domestic violence is not of God. And we believe that God is calling us as a church and as the kingdom of God to do everything that we can to provide for those who need our help. And so what we're going to ask you to do, and many of you have already done that, the Allen Women's Resource Center has many needs. And if you could make a contribution today or next or tomorrow, next week, we would love for you to do that. The giving information is on the screen, but just know that what we do because we believe that God has called us to do what we do in this season. You have heard from these women, and you know that we're doing a great work for God. We're doing a great work for the people of God. And we want to thank God for the sacrifices of Sister Lori Banks, Sister Lily, and of course, Sister Wickham. And of course, we're excited. We have a new director coming in. Reverend Elisa Cupid has replaced Reverend Sister Banks, I'm sorry. But, yeah, right, I'm not going to call you to preach. But at any rate, we pray that you will continue to pray with us, work with us, contribute, and know that God is not through with us yet, and there is much work to do. Thank you so much for joining us, and good evening.